Sultan Murad IV took the Ottoman throne as a child, but he grew into one of the most feared rulers in Ottoman history. He ruled from 1623 to 1640, and people still argue about him because his reign mixed state recovery with extraordinary violence. Some writers remember Murad IV as the ruler who restored order when the empire was shaking from war, mutiny, and rebellion. Other writers remember Murad IV as a man of executions, bans, and fear who ruled like a monster inside his own empire. The hardest part of the story is that both pictures fit the evidence because Murad IV was effective and brutal at the same time. He was born in 1612, and he was the son of Sultan Ahmed I and Kosum Sultan. Kosum Sultan was one of the most influential women in Ottoman political history, and her power shaped Murad's earliest years as sultan. Murad came to the throne in 1623 at about 11 years old, after his uncle Mustafa I was deposed. An 11-year-old ruler could not truly control a huge empire alone, so power first sat with Kosum Sultan and palace factions. That fact already tells us the Ottoman center was unstable, because the empire was being managed through regents, factions, and court struggle. The early 17th century brought repeated succession problems, Janissary unrest, provincial rebellion, fiscal strain, and military embarrassment. That means Murad did not inherit a calm palace, a disciplined army, and quiet provinces ready to obey him. He inherited a state whose political center was wobbling while soldiers, officials, and rebels tested its weakness. The empire faced trouble inside the palace and outside the palace at the same time during Murad's childhood reign. One major shock came in 1624, when the Safavids recaptured Baghdad from the Ottomans. Baghdad was not a small city on the edge of the map because it had strategic, commercial, and religious importance. Losing Baghdad hurt Ottoman prestige, weakened military confidence, and showed that Safavid Iran could strike the empire hard. At the same time, Anatolia was dealing with revolts and banditry, which meant disorder was also spreading inside Ottoman lands. Military discipline had weakened too, and that mattered in an empire where central power depended heavily on military obedience. So before Murad IV became the strong ruler of later memory, he was the child ruler of a threatened empire. That crisis background is the first reason some historians call him a necessary tyrant instead of only a monster. They argue that he did not receive a healthy state and then choose cruelty for amusement. They argue that he received a damaged state and answered that damage with hard, violent centralization. A major turning point came in 1632, and this year matters more than almost any other in Murad's life. In 1632, Janissaries and other rebels stormed the palace environment and killed leading officials. For a young sultan already raised inside court danger, that attack was not only a political event. It was a direct trauma at the center of his own world, and many historians treat it as deeply formative. After 1632, Murad IV moved hard to seize personal power and cut down rival influence around him. He reduced the role of Kosum Sultan and competing factions, and he ruled in a much more direct way. This is where the boy on the throne turned into the feared ruler later generations remembered. Murad's answer to mutiny was not patient persuasion or slow institution building in the modern sense. His answer was to reassert sovereign fear and make the empire feel the presence of the sultan again. He cracked down on corruption, tried to discipline the military, and punished officials more directly than many earlier rulers. He wanted soldiers, officials, and courtmen to understand that the center still had force. In the Ottoman system, symbolic authority mattered almost as much as military authority. If the ruler looked weak, unrest could spread quickly through the army, the court, and the provinces. Murad understood that, so he crafted the image of an active warrior ruler rather than a secluded palace figure. That image had political value because the Ottoman ideal still admired the warrior sultan who could lead in person. Chroniclers emphasized Murad's physical strength, his courage, and his imposing presence. They wanted readers to see a sovereign who could ride with soldiers, command armies, and force obedience. For supporters, this was exactly what the empire needed after years of wobbling authority and public embarrassment. Murad was not only posing as strong in Istanbul, because he also produced real military results. He personally led major campaigns against Safavid Iran, and personal command mattered greatly in Ottoman political culture. A ruler who rode with the army could restore imperial mystique in ways that palace orders alone could not. In 1635, Murad captured Revan, usually identified with Yerevan, though the Ottoman hold there was temporary. That success helped his reputation, but it was not his most important military achievement. The campaign that truly defined him came in 1638 with the recapture of Baghdad. Murad personally led that campaign too, and Baghdad had been a painful Ottoman loss since 1624. The siege was hard, and the city mattered for strategy, trade, prestige, and religion. When Murad retook Baghdad in 1638, he recovered far more than a point on the map. He recovered a symbol of Ottoman strength that had been missing for 14 years. This is one reason the case for Murad as a state restorer cannot simply be dismissed. A ruler who recaptures Baghdad after disorder, mutiny, and military embarrassment has done something very serious. The military success at Baghdad also fed Murad's image as the old Ottoman warrior sultan brought back to life. He was no longer only the child of palace factions or the survivor of Janissary intimidation. He was the ruler who could march, besiege, and win one of the empire's most meaningful victories. Then came the Treaty of Zuhab in 1639, 1 year after the recovery of Baghdad. That treaty broadly stabilized the Ottoman Safavid frontier, and historians often treat that as a lasting achievement. Some even see the Treaty of Zuhab as helping shape the long-term border pattern between Ottoman and Iranian worlds. In rough form, that later pattern echoed the frontier zones later linked to Iraq-Iran and Turkey-Iran regions. That is not a tiny detail, because it means Murad's reign affected borders beyond his short life. So if someone asks why any historian would ever defend Murad IV, the answer begins here. He inherited a troubled empire, reasserted central authority, retook Baghdad, and helped stabilize the frontier in 1639. Those are not imaginary achievements created by flattering court poetry after his death. Those are concrete results that gave the Ottoman center real prestige during a difficult period. He also revived the image of a sovereign who could act instead of merely survive inside palace intrigue. For supporters, Murad did not just punish people, he reminded the empire that it still had a ruler. But the argument changes the moment we turn from results to methods, because Murad's methods were terrifying. He became associated with summary executions, harsh surveillance, and a climate of public fear. That climate of fear is central to the argument that he was not merely harsh, but monstrous. He did not only punish obvious rebellion after 1632, he made unpredictability part of rule itself. People could feel that disobedience might bring sudden death, not only legal correction. Murad is famous for banning coffeehouses, tobacco, and alcohol at different points of his reign. He presented these bans as moral and political discipline, which already tells us they had two sides. The moral side spoke the language of order and public conduct. The political side targeted spaces and habits linked to rumor, sedition, and opposition. Coffeehouses mattered especially because they were places where people gathered, talked, and exchanged news. In Murad's eyes, a coffeehouse was not simply a room where men drank coffee. It was a social space where conversation could turn into criticism, and criticism could turn into danger. For a ruler shaped by mutiny and palace violence, those spaces looked threatening. That helps explain why the bans were enforced so harshly, sometimes with lethal consequences. Later tradition loved the image of Murad moving through Istanbul in disguise to catch violators himself. Some of those stories may be embroidered, but they reflect a real reputation rooted in fear. People remembered him as a ruler who could appear unexpectedly and order instant execution. Even if some details grew larger in retelling, the reputation itself tells us something important. Murad governed through unpredictability, inspection, and the possibility of swift death. That is why his bans on coffeehouses, tobacco, and alcohol became more than moral rules. They became symbols of a ruler who wanted control over streets, speech, and social gathering. Coffeehouses are especially revealing because coffee itself was not the deeper danger. The deeper danger was conversation beyond direct state control, especially in a tense imperial capital. That means Murad's laws were political tools as much as religious or moral measures. He feared places where rumor could move faster than royal command. He feared spaces where men could gather outside the Sultan's immediate reach. And after the rebellion of 1632, that fear was not abstract to him. He had already seen what armed unrest and factional violence could do near the palace itself. So the coffeehouse bans were part of the same larger answer he gave after trauma. He tightened control, narrowed public space, and used fear to keep opposition from breathing. For defenders, that was grim necessity in a dangerous age. For critics, that was proof that Murad turned crisis into a system of personal despotism. His violence did not stop with common people in streets and coffeehouses. It reached into elite politics, high offices, and even his own family. The Ottoman dynasty had long accepted fratricide as a harsh tool to prevent civil war. Even within that severe dynastic tradition, Murad's reign stands out for lethal control. Several princes were killed during his reign, and only his brother Ibrahim survived him. That fact is chilling because it shows how closely Murad linked security with elimination. He did not treat possible rivals as distant problems that might someday matter. He treated them as present dangers inside a political world already soaked in fear. Only Ibrahim survived Murad, and when Murad died in 1640, Ibrahim became sultan. Murad's treatment of high officials was severe too, and powerful men could fall abruptly. Grand viziers could lose favor suddenly, and religious authorities were not fully safe either. This means his fear politics touched almost every layer of Ottoman life, from princes to ministers to ordinary people. That is one reason many historians resist heroic language when Murad's name comes up. They argue that praising his effectiveness can slide too easily into romanticizing authoritarian violence. Their question is simple but sharp. Did Murad rebuild institutions, or did he mostly silence disorder? That difference matters because strong institutions can survive a ruler, while fear often dies when the ruler dies. Murad clearly restored obedience in the short term, but did he leave durable reform behind him? The evidence makes that hard to claim with confidence, because many of his controls loosened after his death in 1640. If his restoration had been deeply institutional, it would likely have remained stronger after he was gone. Instead, much of it seems to have depended on his body, his will, and his personal menace. That is why some historians call him a crisis ruler rather than a model ruler. A crisis ruler can be effective in the moment and still fail to solve deeper structural weakness. Murad's reign fits that pattern closely, because the short-term restoration was inseparable from personal terror. He did not merely repair the Ottoman machine and leave it better built. He reminded everyone that the Ottoman machine could still bite. His moral legislation shows another troubling contradiction that weakens the image of him as a righteous disciplinarian. Murad is famous for banning alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, yet multiple historical accounts portray him as a heavy drinker. Many scholars believe alcoholism contributed to his early death, often described as cirrhosis. He died in 1640 at only 27 years old, which makes his whole reign feel compressed and intense. This contradiction matters because it suggests the bans were not only about piety. They were also about control over behavior, urban space, and the movement of conversation. A ruler who bans alcohol while drinking heavily himself does not look morally consistent. He looks like a ruler using moral regulation as one instrument of power. That does not erase the real disorder he faced, but it does change how we read his laws. The laws look less like pure reform, and more like political discipline wrapped in moral language. Coffeehouses fit that reading especially well, because coffee itself was not the true threat. The threat was the social world built around coffeehouses, where rumor and sedition could circulate. Tobacco, alcohol, and coffee all became linked to control because they gathered people into semi-independent spaces and habits. Murad wanted a public world that felt watched and corrected from above. That desire makes sense after 1632, but it also reveals how deeply fear shaped his governing instincts. The more we look at his reign, the harder it becomes to separate strategy from paranoia. That is why the title question stays alive: necessary tyrant or just a monster? The answer depends partly on what question we ask of the past. If we ask whether the Ottoman state needed a ruler who could crush mutiny, frighten factions, and restore prestige, Murad looks necessary. If we ask whether his methods crossed humane limits and made fear into daily government, Murad looks monstrous. The evidence supports both judgments because his achievements and his cruelty came from the same style of rule. His personal history also sharpens the tension between those two judgments. He was young, physically imposing, militarily active, politically traumatized, personally contradictory, and dead by 27. That combination gives him a dramatic shape that almost invites extreme interpretations. He can look like the last great warrior sultan in one telling. He can look like the prototype of a paranoid autocrat in another. And the record contains enough evidence for both stories to survive. His supporters point first to context, and context does matter. The early 17th century empire faced succession problems, Janissary unrest, provincial rebellion, fiscal strain, and military embarrassment. The Safavids took Baghdad in 1624, Anatolia suffered revolts and banditry, and military discipline had weakened. Then Janissaries and rebels stormed the palace environment in 1632 and killed leading officials. From that angle, Murad's later severity was not added to a healthy state. It was forged inside a state that looked close to losing control of itself. Supporters also point to results, and those results were real. Murad reduced the influence of rival factions, disciplined parts of the center, captured Revan in 1635, retook Baghdad in 1638, and saw the Treaty of Zuhab in 1639 stabilize the frontier. Those are solid achievements for a ruler who began as an 11-year-old in a shaken court. Supporters finally point to symbolism, because symbolism was real power in the Ottoman world. Murad made the Sultan visible again as a warrior and commander, not only as a palace prisoner of factions. For an empire whose mystique had been damaged, that symbolic restoration mattered. But critics answer with costs, and the costs were severe. Murad's centralization ran through executions, surveillance, bans, and lethal enforcement. Princes died, officials fell abruptly, coffeehouses were targeted, and fear reached through the capital. Critics ask whether an empire truly recovers when obedience comes mainly from terror. They also ask what happens when a ruler's solutions are so personal that they weaken as soon as he dies. That appears to have happened after 1640 when many of Murad's controls loosened. So the central debate is not whether Murad IV was violent. The central debate is whether his violence was a grim medicine or a destructive addiction of power. The answer may be that it was both at once. He used violence to restore state authority, and then that same violence became the very character of his rule. That is why the word necessary feels uncomfortable and the word monster feels incomplete. Necessary can excuse too much, while monster can ignore real crisis. A stronger judgment keeps both truths in view without pretending they cancel each other. Murad IV was effective in the short run, especially in reimposing obedience and recovering prestige. He was also a ruler whose achievements cannot be separated from the machinery of fear that produced them. His reign teaches that state survival and moral legitimacy do not always travel together. A government can become stronger in one sense, while becoming harsher and more terrifying in another. Murad's world after 1632 shows that clearly. The center became more forceful, but it also became more lethal. Baghdad returned to Ottoman hands, but public life also moved under deeper fear. The frontier stabilized through the Treaty of Zuhab, but dynastic and urban politics remained marked by violence. That is why Murad's legacy feels both successful and deeply troubling. If he had only failed, he would be easier to dismiss. If he had only succeeded without terror, he would be easier to praise. Because he succeeded through terror, he remains morally difficult and historically important. He forces us to think about what kind of ruler appears when a state feels cornered. He also forces us to ask what societies are willing to forgive if the ruler delivers order and victory. Murad's story offers no comforting answer because the evidence stays split. He rescued a weakening imperial center, and he did so by becoming one of the most feared Ottoman rulers. That double truth is not a flaw in the story. That double truth is the story. His reign is best understood in layers, and each layer changes the judgment. The first layer is crisis, because he faced war with Safavid Iran, unrest in Anatolia, and Janissary pressure. The second layer is action, because he seized personal power after 1632 and forced the center back into obedience. The third layer is achievement, because he personally led campaigns, retook Baghdad in 1638, and saw the Treaty of Zuhab in 1639 stabilize the frontier. The fourth layer is cost, because the restoration came with executions, family killings, surveillance, and deadly enforcement of bans. Ignore the crisis layer, and Murad looks like senseless cruelty. Ignore the cost layer, and Murad looks like a romantic strongman rescuing a state. History becomes clearer only when both layers stay on the table together. That is why balanced historians often avoid easy labels for Murad IV. They do not deny his brutality, and they do not deny his effectiveness. They say instead that he was a crisis ruler whose success was fused to fear. That phrasing matters because it neither excuses nor flattens him. It admits that the Ottoman center really was in trouble. It also admits that Murad answered that trouble with methods that exceeded humane limits. His early death at 27 adds another tragic note to the story. He compressed childhood accession, palace trauma, military glory, harsh absolutism, and decline into less than 3 decades of life. That short lifespan makes his reign feel almost too intense for the years it covered. Yet the argument about him has lasted far longer than his life. Every time people debate whether harsh rulers save states or poison them, Murad IV returns to the discussion. His reign shows how the promise of order can arrive hand in hand with terror. It shows how military success can coexist with fear at home. It shows how a ruler can restore prestige without building a gentler or more durable political system. Murad looked like salvation to people who feared collapse. Murad looked like a monster to people who measured the human cost of his order. Both groups can point to real evidence from 1623 to 1640. That is why he remains one of the most polarizing sultans in Ottoman history. The empire he inherited was damaged, and he did make it feel dangerous again. But he made it feel dangerous to enemies and subjects alike. He frightened Safavid rivals with campaigns and frightened his own world with punishment. In that sense, his rule had one unifying logic: power had to be felt. Power had to be visible in the field, visible in the capital, and visible in the fate of those who resisted. That logic brought results, especially at Baghdad. That same logic also filled his reign with a fear that outlived him in memory. The memory is part of the history here, not a decorative extra. Later tales of Murad in disguise, catching violators and ordering death, may be embroidered. But they survived because they matched a ruler already known for harsh control. People remembered him that way because he had taught them to remember him that way. Even his contradictions strengthened the dark image. A ruler banning alcohol while drinking heavily himself looked less like moral reform and more like command for command's sake. That does not erase the real crises he faced. It does show how power and hypocrisy could sit side by side in his reign. So was Murad IV necessary? If necessary means the empire in the 1620s and 1630s may have needed an unusually hard centralizer, the answer can be yes. So was Murad IV a monster? If monster means a ruler whose brutality crossed humane limits and spread fear through public, elite, and family life, the answer can also be yes. The strongest conclusion is that both answers stand at the same time. Murad IV was not a model of good government. Murad IV was a crisis ruler who made the Ottoman state obey again by making people fear what disobedience would cost. That is why his story still grips readers and viewers. It is not a clean tale of heroism, and it is not a simple tale of evil. It is the story of an empire in danger and a ruler who answered danger with force powerful enough to save and scar at once.